Last week, after Senator John McCain traveled to Syria, we spent a lot of time looking at this picture, the senator posing and smiling with a group of Syrian men. Men who to most Americans were completely anonymous. But as we told you last week, it turns out that according to a Lebanese newspaper, this man's name is Mohammed Noor, and he is allegedly associated with a Syrian rebel group who kidnapped 11 Lebanese religious pilgrims last May. McCain's office has called the photo regrettable, but he was back at it this weekend, defending not only his position to arm rebels, but the character of the rebels themselves.
They are not al-Qaeda. They are not extremists. I met with some 19 battalion commanders, both in Turkey and in Syria, but they're badly outgunned now. So I met them. General Idris, who is the commander of the military inside Syria, escorted me in and out. He's a fine leader.
Now, John McCain's trip to Syria became defined in many ways by this picture and the reports about this man, because they almost perfectly encapsulate the many problems with arming the rebels. But while the picture has been shown across the world thousands of times over, the attention has all been on this one man. Well, who are the other people in the photo? What is their story? Well, after we talked about John McCain's trip to Syria last week, a friend of mine who lives in Washington, D.C. emailed me and said, "Hey, I know one of the guys in that photo. Not the alleged kidnapping associate, but this guy." Turns out this man is the person who actually arranged the trip. His name is Muaz Mustafa. He has spent years working on Capitol Hill. He's now executive director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, an organization that raises awareness in the U.S. about the Assad regime, and the political director for United for a Free Syria, an advocacy group. And he joins me now. Muaz, thank you so much for joining me. First, I just want to get a sense from you. How did you find yourself in this position? How did this trip come about?
Thank you for having me. And as far as this trip, I'm regularly back and forth between Washington, D.C. and Syria, usually working with emerging civilian governing structures that are rising up in the liberated areas. And we usually regularly brief Congress. So when we heard of Senator McCain's willingness and interest in going and visiting and meeting with the Free Syria Army commanders, we saw that as something that's very welcome, and we were more than happy to facilitate at least getting out the commanders into Turkey for meetings, 10 commanders in the first meeting in Gaziantep, 4 in the second one, and then the meeting inside Syria territory. And so we were already there working on some of the things that we work regularly on through our offices in Syria and Turkey, and we're more than happy to arrange the visit for the senator.
But how did you come to be an intermediary in this? I mean, my understanding is you yourself are not Syrian, and I'm sort of fascinated by the kind of structure that's grown up in the U.S. from in terms of lobbying the government for further aid for the rebels. It's just very hard for me to figure out, like, who are these people? Like, who are you? Why are you involved in this battle?
Sure, absolutely. Look, I was born in Damascus, Syria. I moved to the United States when I was 12 years old. I went to college in high school in Arkansas, college in Missouri and Arkansas, and then came and worked on the Hill, as you mentioned before. My father is Palestinian and my mother is Syrian, and I identify most when I think of Syria with kids that were my age. I left at about 12 years old, and so when I go back, I see those 12 years old kids, and I see what challenges they face every day. Syria, more than anything, beyond the complexities of the revolution and the interest of the region, is a humanitarian disaster that, according to Oxfam International's president, rivals or surpasses what's happening in Darfur. You're talking about a regime that sends Scud missiles, that has used chemical weapons, that uses its army to kill civilians. A revolution that for 7 to 8 months at the beginning was completely peaceful, non-violent at all, by his own words. And so that's the simplicity of it, and I think that's missed a lot by all the other sort of values that comes around.
I want to ask about complexity rather than simplicity. So sure. This photo, right, the man who, according to Daily Star report, a Lebanese newspaper, was identified as having been a photographer for a group that kidnapped these Shiite pilgrims. What do you know about that? Do you know who that man is? Was he associated with your group?
So I was responsible for getting all the commanders from different geographical parts of Syria, Qusayr, Aleppo, Homs, and other places, 19 all together, to come out and meet in 3 separate meetings. In the meeting that was arranged inside of Syria, the people, first of all, the gentleman outside that's referred to by the Daily Star paper, but the Daily Star paper, and this is a fact we know after talking to them, got its news from a Hezbollah mouthpiece TV report that came out. So it's very disturbing disturbing to see how Hezbollah propaganda has overtaken the word of a senator, the State Department, Syrian American NGOs, and the Free Syria Army Command, all of which, again, reassured many times that there were no kidnappers whatsoever. The two referred to in the article, one of them is dead. We knew and confirmed that he's dead earlier this year, and he's been listed missing since last fall. The other gentleman, Mohammed Noor, was not present. That gentleman outside didn't identify by that name, and neither did he take part in the meeting, which is very important. He wasn't even sitting. I sent a picture to the producer of the meeting itself to
he was
right.
He was not in the meeting, and you've definitively said he's not the person in question. But the broader point here, right, is that there's a group called the Northern Storm Brigade, and they're associated with the rebels. That's not disputed, right? They are fighting against the Assad regime, and it's also not disputed that they just pulled over a bus of religious pilgrims coming back from a pilgrimage to take hostages, to hold them as bargaining trips. And I want to hear, when I hear stories like that, it makes me really, wait, hold on one second. When I hear stories like that, it makes me, and I think people who hear those stories, really worry about what we are about to get into in Syria. And I want to bring in my friend and colleague Jeremy Scahill, and I want to talk about what actual intervention in Syria right now would look like. And Muaz, if you would like to explain to me why my fears about the U.S. becoming more bound in this conflict are overstated. I want to hear that as well, right after we take this break.
Sure.
Like I said, joining me at the table tonight is Jeremy Scahill, producer and writer of Dirty Wars, which opens this Friday. There's a movie version that's absolutely astounding. You have to see it. It opens this Friday, June 7th. He's also author of a book by the same name, national security correspondent for the Nation. Jeremy, I want to talk to you, and I want to come back to Muaz as well, but I want to talk to you about, as a very experienced war correspondent in the region, what the track record of U.S. intervention in bringing about humanitarian outcomes has been as a general matter.
It's been a disaster. I mean, I think that you could say that the U.S. has been one of the primary destabilizing forces in the region. I mean, you look at Syria's neighbor, Iraq. The United States invades Iraq, and of course, John McCain was a huge cheerleader for that. If it was up to him, there would still be 100,000 plus U.S. troops. What was it that really happened in Iraq? They say, well, the surge won the war in Iraq. No, what happened is that the U.S. backed Shiite death squads called the Wolf Brigades that were effectively just murdering people and then paid off Sunni tribes not to shoot at American forces. So you had this fake victory that was declared in the form of the surge. Iraq is in an utter state of chaos with suicide bombings regularly.
And in fact, exporting a lot of folks
to Syria. Now it's becoming deeply involved. And Syria has also had to deal with a huge refugee crisis from Iraq as a result of this. Then you look at Libya, where the United States was deeply involved with overthrowing, admittedly, a horrid dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. And then you have these Islamist radical groups that end up butchering our ambassador and overrunning a consulate. We don't know who we're backing in a lot of these cases. It's very short-sighted goals. And I think John McCain has no credibility on this issue. This man has never met a sort of rebel group that he hasn't been in love with. He has a multi-decade track record of calling for it. And in the end, it turns out, had we listened to McCain, it would have been an even greater disaster.
So, Muaz, my question for you is this. Let's stipulate, I think, universally how loathsome the Assad regime is, how horrible they've been. I mean, just at that, I don't think there's anyone here that disagrees with that. The question is just as a sheer practical matter. Does more U.S. involvement, do more weapons flowing in, what plausible case is that for reducing the humanitarian disaster as opposed to simply prolonging it?
Sure. First of all, Syria is not a partisan issue. It is a humanitarian issue and a national security issue for the United States and for the region as a whole, including our allies. So what John McCain does or does not do should not mold our views on this issue. Number two, Syria is a place...
Wait, stop there right a second. Why not? John McCain has a record here, right? He's making a judgment call, and as people who interpret politics, right, I don't think it's crazy to make some of your reasoning off the track record of someone who's making this kind of argument.
You should make your reasoning based on what's happening on the ground, based on what the situation is in the region, and based on your understanding of all the facts, not on what John McCain does or doesn't do. John McCain could be right and could be wrong on many issues. He could have a track record either way, but that should not be the way that you make your decisions or anybody else does. But as far as Syria is concerned, right now, as we're talking, Qusayr is under heavy gunfire and heavy airstrikes, surrounded by more than 5,000 members of Hezbollah. We're talking about a country that is in the Middle East, where Iran is actively working to save its own interests in the region, regardless if Assad survives this or not. Right. You know, where they keep their enclaves, where they're able to continue to arm Hezbollah, where we have major implications for the region and for us in the future. And being able to support a hierarchy where we see people that have joined Islamist battalions and others that by no means subscribe to their ideology, begging for a third way out, and to have a hierarchy and a structure of commanders willing to be under civilian command and to see in the mostly liberated areas democratic elections that are rising up and having Christian and Muslim schools in towns. It's beautiful to see, and that's what's inspiring, and that's what I feel is missed
Jeremy,
so many times.
I want Jeremy you to respond to this proxy war point about Iran and Hezbollah.
I mean, first of all, there already is a full-blown proxy war going on in Syria. That's not a disputable fact. The United States already is involved with destabilizing Syria, but the other part of this is that the very forces that John McCain wants us to get in bed with have not actually been vetted. The fact is there are massive human rights abuses that are being committed on a daily basis also by the so-called rebels in Syria. Bashar al-Assad is a thug and a gangster, but I don't have any faith that many of these groups that are being generically referred to as the rebels are going to be anything other than thugs and gangsters themselves. And I think this is a civil war that already too many countries and too many weapons are involved with. The United States getting involved with can only make it worse.
Waz, quickly, what assurance can you give when people say there's going to be a vetted opposition that in the midst of a war zone that weapons aren't going to, say, move around?
Well, first of all, remember, weapons are coming in regardless. Whether we arm or not, weapons are coming in from Gulf states, from other places, regardless of that fact. And so it's important for the United States, which vets when it does give weapons, to give weapons to the right people. And we're not saying give weapons to everyone.
You should ask the Somali people if the United States vets its rebels, because it certainly does not vet them. And in fact, the United States, there are amendments that have been passed by Congress where the United States is supposed to vet the very people that it's giving weapons and support to. And time and again, human rights groups produce evidence that that's just not being enforced. So I don't believe that.
You're talking in, look, we're talking not in general for all the rebels. Yeah. We're talking about the hierarchy of defected rebels that left because they didn't want to shoot back at their own civilians. Right. They didn't want to kill their own families to be able to support them to end this war.
Was Mustafa, Executive Director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, Jeremy Scahill, producer and writer of Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield. Thank you very much. That is all in for this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.